telltale marks around their throats made it clear that they had suffered the same. Chris was different, aloof, irritable, and secretive. And Sherry, trusting but not naive, had begun to sense that something was terribly wrong. She confided in her best friend Lisa during a lunch date at their favorite cafe. Stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, Sherry hesitated before finally voicing the suspicion that had gnawed at her for months. "I think Chris is seeing someone else." Lisa nearly dropped her spoon. "What? No way, are you sure?" Sherry exhaled, her fingers tightening around the mug. I don't have proof, but I can feel it. A woman always knows. Lisa leaned in, lowering her voice. What's he been doing? Sherry listed the signs, each one a nail in the coffin of her marriage. The late-night phone calls, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. The sudden business trips that hadn't been part of his schedule before. The way he had started guarding his phone, taking it with him even to the bathroom. And then, the most damning evidence, the faint but unmistakable scent of another woman's perfume on his shirts. It wasn't hers. She had confronted him, of course. Chris, is there something you need to tell me? His reaction had been immediate, defensive, too defensive. You're being paranoid, he snapped, shaking his head. You think I'd do that to you, to our family? She had wanted to believe him. God, she had wanted to believe him. But the doubt wouldn't leave her. It festered, gnawed at her, kept her awake at night. She started watching him more closely, noticing the way he would disappear into their bedroom to take calls, the way he started working out obsessively as if preparing for something, the way his kisses felt obligatory instead of loving. And then the threats started. At first, she thought they were just sick pranks. Anonymous emails warning her that her family was in danger, that she needed to convince Chris to leave his job as the security chief for a high-profile televangelist, that if he didn't, there would be consequences. The words chilled her to the bone. Have paid. I saw you leave. I won't be safe for long. She showed them to Chris. He barely looked at them before brushing them off. It's just some nut job, he said. I get threats all the time. But these weren't threats directed at him. They were directed at her and their children. And yet, Chris seemed unfazed. He didn't report them, didn't change their security measures, nothing. It was as if he didn't care. Or worse, he already knew who was sending them. The tension between them deepened. Sherry started to feel like she was living with a stranger. She found herself withdrawing, finding solace in her sons, in the friends who still made her feel safe. But in the quiet moments, when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, a terrifying question haunted her. How far would Chris go to rid himself of the family that had once been his entire world? She didn't want to believe the answer. The police didn't have to look far for a suspect. From the moment investigators stepped into the Coleman home, the crime scene screamed of something deeply personal. The sheer brutality of the murders, the calculated precision, the chilling messages scrawled on the walls. It was clear that whoever had done this had a vendetta. And as detectives began to peel back the layers of Chris Coleman's life, they found something that made their stomachs churn. Chris's alibi was weak. He claimed he had spent the early morning hours at the gym, a story that surveillance footage at first seemed to confirm. But when detectives pulled his cell phone records, the cracks in his story widened. He had sent text messages and made phone calls at times that didn't align with his supposed timeline. Even more damning, his movements placed him at home long enough to commit the crime before heading out to create his alibi. Then came the bombshell. As investigators scoured his digital footprint, a name surfaced repeatedly: Tara Lintz. Tara was younger than Sherry, blonde, strikingly beautiful, and most importantly, impatient. She was no casual fling. She was the other woman, and she wasn't content with being a mistress anymore. Detectives traced Chris's relationship with Tara back several months. She was an old friend of Sherry's from Florida, which made the betrayal even more chilling. At first, the messages between Chris and Tara were flirtatious and suggestive, but as the months wore on, they became something more sinister. Tara wasn't just demanding Chris's attention, she was demanding his commitment. I'm tired of waiting, she had texted him weeks before the murders. It's me or her. Chris responded with vague assurances. I'll take care of it, just give me time. Time had run out. The affair wasn't just emotional, it was intense, consuming, and reckless. Chris had promised Tara a new life together, free from the burdens of his wife and children. He had showered her with gifts, flown to meet her under the guise of work trips, and even discussed their future as if his marriage was already over. To Tara, it was only a matter of logistics. The problem wasn't if Chris would leave Sherry, but when. As investigators dug deeper, they found something even more incriminating. Chris and Tara had exchanged explicit emails, videos, and messages. Some sent just hours before Sherry and the boys were murdered. His words, casual yet filled with implication, sent a chill through the detectives. Not much longer. A phrase repeated in multiple messages, a promise, a countdown. And then there was the most damning evidence of all. In one exchange, Tara had sent Chris a message reading, "We can finally be together soon." To which he had responded, "I know, I just have to take care of it first." By now, the pieces of the puzzle were fitting together in a way that painted a horrifying picture. Chris Coleman, the security chief of a televangelist, a man who had built his reputation on protecting others, had been plotting the unthinkable. Not only had he been unfaithful, but he had also been devising a way to erase his family from existence. But detectives still needed a motive beyond lust. Why not simply divorce Sherry and be with Tara? The answer lay in Chris's job. As the head of security for a high-profile Christian organization, Chris's reputation was everything. The televangelist he worked for preached strict family values, condemning adultery and divorce. If Chris left his wife, he wouldn't just be shamed and he'd lose everything: his salary, his lifestyle, and his standing in the community. Divorce wasn't an option for a man like Chris Coleman. But widowhood? Widowhood meant sympathy, a fresh start, and insurance payouts. Detectives combed through his financials and found that Chris had multiple life insurance policies on Sherry and the children. If they died, he would collect a significant sum, enough to start over and build a new life with Tara, far away from the wreckage of the one he had destroyed. As the evidence mounted, police brought Tara in for questioning. She was composed at first, but when confronted with the messages, her demeanor shifted. She insisted she had nothing to do with the murders, that she had never asked Chris to harm his family. But her impatience, her pressure, and demands, they had undeniably pushed him to the edge. The final blow came when forensic analysis revealed something chilling. The threatening emails Sherry had received, the ones warning that her family would die, had been sent from a computer linked to Chris. He hadn't just planned the murders, he had staged the threats to make it look like someone else had been after them. Cold, calculated, and heartless. With all the evidence in place, detectives knew what they had to do. They put Chris under surveillance, watching his every move. It wouldn't be long before they made their move. But as they closed in on him, Chris did something no one expected. Detectives combed through security footage from nearby businesses, sifting through hours of recordings in the hopes of catching a break. It didn't take long for them to find something that sent a chill through the entire investigative team. At precisely 3 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared on the grainy footage, moving toward the Coleman residence. The figure was cautious, deliberate, avoiding streetlights and sticking close to the shadows. By 5:43 a.m., the same figure was seen leaving, but this time moving faster, almost hurriedly, as if they had just finished something they couldn't take back. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they noticed something else. Chris's car was parked a block away from his home. It wasn't visible from the house, but it was close enough to be within reach. It was a strategic placement, one that suggested careful planning rather than a coincidence. The detectives knew they needed more to solidify their case, so they dug deeper into Chris's financial records. What they found was yet another damning piece of evidence. Just days before the murders, Chris had made a purchase on his credit card: a hunting knife and a pair of black tactical gloves. The transaction had been completed at an outdoor supply store not far from his office. The choice of items was telling. A hunting knife was not something Chris typically bought, nor did he have any known interest in hunting. And the gloves? They were designed to prevent leaving fingerprints behind. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Crime scene investigators had carefully collected every possible piece of forensic evidence from the house, dusting for prints and analyzing every surface. When they processed the murder weapon, a serrated hunting knife, they found a single, smudged fingerprint on the handle. The moment the results came back, there was no longer doubt. It was a match. Chris Coleman's fingerprint was on the very weapon that had been used to slaughter his wife and 2 children. With mounting evidence, detectives knew they had Chris backed into a corner. But they wanted to be meticulous and airtight in their approach. They revisited the security footage, running enhancement software to get a clearer picture of the suspect's build and gait. The analysis confirmed what they already suspected. The figure on the screen wasn't just similar to Chris in height and movement, it was him. Meanwhile, detectives brought in more experts to analyze Chris's digital activity. His computer history revealed a disturbing pattern. In the weeks leading up to the murders, he had searched for topics that raised serious red flags. Terms like how to commit the perfect murder, how to erase fingerprints from a crime scene, and even chillingly specific searches related to strangulation and knife attacks. He had also accessed multiple email accounts that were linked to the threatening messages Sherry had been receiving in the months before her death. It was becoming clear that Chris had orchestrated the entire thing, from the fake threats to the carefully staged crime scene. The next step was to confront Chris. Detectives brought him in for questioning, presenting him with the evidence piece by piece. At first, he was calm, even arrogant. He stuck to his original story. He had been at the gym, he had tried to call Sherry multiple times, and when she didn't answer, he had grown worried. But then they showed him the security footage. His confidence faltered and his jaw tightened. His fingers twitched on the table. "That could be anyone," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. Then came the receipts, the hunting knife, the gloves, the timeline of his purchases. He swallowed hard, shifting in his chair. I bought those for protection," he stammered, "because of the threats." Detectives leaned in. "Then why didn't you report those threats to your boss? Why didn't you install more security at your home? Why was your car parked a block away at the exact time the killer entered and left?" Chris had no answer. His gaze flickered to the two-way mirror as if searching for an escape route, and then they presented the final blow, the fingerprint on the murder weapon. Silence. A long, suffocating silence. Chris's face drained of color. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. He knew, and they knew, that there was no talking his way out of this. Detectives pressed harder. "Did Tara know about this?" Chris flinched at the mention of her name. "We have the messages, Chris. We know about the affair. We know about the ultimatum. We know about your search history." The room felt smaller, closing in around him. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He had played every angle, convinced he had planned the perfect crime, but he hadn't accounted for one thing, his own arrogance. He thought he could outsmart the system, that he could manipulate the evidence, but the truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface. Chris Coleman was out of moves, and the walls were closing in fast. Chris Coleman was arrested in front of his colleagues at his workplace. It was a scene that would remain etched in their memories forever. Dressed in his usual work attire, he had been going about his day as if nothing had happened, as if his family hadn't been savagely murdered just days before. The moment detectives walked into his office, a hush fell over the room. The tension was thick and suffocating. His coworkers exchanged uneasy glances, their gazes shifting from the officers to Chris, who sat at his desk, expression unreadable. "Chris Coleman, you're under arrest for the murders of Sherry Coleman, Garrett Coleman, and Gavin Coleman," one of the detectives announced, his voice firm, unwavering. For a split second, Chris remained still, as if he hadn't heard them. Then slowly he turned to face the officers. His expression was eerily neutral. No shock, no outrage, no desperate denials. Just a quiet detachment that sent a shiver through the room. "This is a mistake," he finally said, his voice calm, too calm. But the detectives weren't there to debate. They pulled his hands behind his back, securing the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. His coworkers watched in stunned silence as their head of security, once trusted and respected, was led through the office in disgrace. The weight of the accusations settled over the room like a dark cloud. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "Oh my God, he really did it." Chris Coleman's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The idea that a man who had built his life around protection and security could be capable of such a monstrous crime was unthinkable. But as the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time dismantling the illusion of innocence he tried to maintain. The courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the streets outside, capturing every arrival, every reaction. Reporters whispered updates into their microphones, relaying the latest details to a public that was hungry for justice. The media frenzy surrounding the case was relentless. Everyone wanted to understand what could drive a man to butcher his own family. The prosecution came out swinging, laying out the horrific details of the crime in excruciating clarity. They painted a picture of premeditation so cold, so methodical, that it sent chills through the jury. They presented the timeline, how Chris had parked his car a block away, entered his home in the dead of night, and carried out the brutal killings with calculated precision. How he had then showered, changed his clothes, and left just in time to create an alibi at the gym. The chilling efficiency of it all spoke volumes. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was an execution. The murder weapon, a hunting knife Chris had purchased just days before, was introduced into evidence. The prosecution made sure the jury understood that this was no coincidence. Chris had planned this down to the smallest detail. And then, there was the affair. Chris's relationship with Tara Lintz became the centerpiece of the trial. It was the motive and the driving force behind his monstrous actions. The prosecution unveiled the damning messages, the relentless pressure Tara had placed on him to take care of it, and the disturbing promises he had made to her in return. But the most shocking moment came when Tara herself took the stand. Dressed conservatively, her hair pulled back, Tara Lintz sat before the court, her hands folded in her lap. She looked nothing like the woman Chris had exchanged explicit messages with. She appeared nervous, remorseful, even fearful. The prosecution wasted no time. "Ms. Lintz, did Chris Coleman ever discuss leaving his wife and children?" Tara swallowed hard. "Yes. How often?" "Many times," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said he wanted a new life, one where he didn't have responsibilities." The courtroom murmured. "And did he ever say anything about how he would go about doing that?" Tara hesitated. She glanced toward Chris, who stared at her with an expression so devoid of emotion it sent a shiver down her spine. "Yes," she finally said. "He told me he had a plan." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Chris's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "What exactly did he say?" the prosecutor pressed. Tara exhaled sharply. "He said he would take care of it." Her voice cracked slightly, but she composed herself. "He told me to be patient, that we'd be together soon." More murmurs. A juror shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "And did you believe he was capable of harming his family?" Tara shook her head. "At the time, no. I didn't think he meant it literally. I thought—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "I thought he was just saying things in the heat of the moment." The prosecutor's tone sharpened. "But you gave him an ultimatum, didn't you?" Tara swallowed. "Yes." "What was that ultimatum?" Tears welled in her eyes. "That if he didn't leave Sherry and the kids, I would leave him." The weight of her words hung in the air. She had given Chris a choice, one that, in his mind, left only one solution. After weeks of testimony, after mountains of evidence stacked against him, Chris Coleman's fate was finally in the hands of the jury. The deliberations lasted only a few hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. Chris sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. Chris Coleman showed no emotion, no tears, no outbursts, just the same cold, detached expression he had worn throughout the trial. The judge wasted no time. Given the brutality of the crimes, the premeditation, and the lack of remorse, Chris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, reporters rushed to capture the moment. The once respected security chief, now a convicted murderer, walked out of the courtroom in shackles, his life effectively over. And with him, the last remnants of the perfect life he had so desperately tried to create were shattered beyond repair. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Some people sobbed, others exhaled in quiet relief. Sherry's family clung to one another, their faces streaked with tears. Chris, however, remained still. His expression, as it had been throughout the trial, was disturbingly vacant. No shock, no regret, just the cold, empty gaze of a man who had gambled everything and lost. There would be no second chances, no appeals that could erase the horror of what he had done. Chris didn't flinch. Even as the handcuffs were placed around his wrists, even as he was led away through the courtroom, he remained emotionless. But for those who had known him, worked with him, trusted him, there was no mistaking the truth that he wasn't in shock. He wasn't overwhelmed. He had simply accepted his fate because deep down he knew he had earned it. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones and cameras capturing every reaction. Sherry's sister stood before them, her hands trembling as she clutched a photograph of her sister and two nephews. It was a picture taken on a family vacation before the suspicion, before the betrayal, before the bloodshed. "They deserved better," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Sherry was a good mother. Garrett and Gavin were just babies. They didn't deserve this." Her pain was raw, palpable. Around her, members of the community gathered, some holding candles, others clasping their hands in silent prayer. Columbia, Illinois was a small town, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors looked out for one another. But Chris Coleman had shattered that sense of safety, leaving behind a wound that would never fully heal. At the correctional facility where he was taken, Chris was placed in protective custody. The prison system did not take kindly to men who murdered children, and his high-profile case meant he would always be a target. Behind bars, he was no longer the respected security chief or the secret lover. He was a pariah, a man who had destroyed his own bloodline in pursuit of a selfish fantasy. As time passed, more disturbing details about Chris's mindset emerged. Investigators uncovered old journal entries where he had written about his new life with Tara Lintz. In one passage, he fantasized about living in a tropical paradise, unburdened by responsibility. He had meticulously planned his future with Tara, but in none of his writings did he ever mention grief. There were no words of guilt, no indication that he had struggled with what he was about to do. Perhaps the most chilling revelation came from one of the detectives who worked the case. He didn't just kill them, the detective said in an interview years later. He erased them. He wanted them gone so badly that he didn't even stop to consider what their absence would mean. That's not just murder, that's something darker, something inhuman. Chris Coleman may have thought he was eliminating an obstacle, but instead, he ensured that his name would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. His story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how far human selfishness can go. Sherry Coleman's family worked to preserve her memory, establishing a foundation in her name to support domestic violence awareness. Though Chris had never physically abused Sherry, his emotional manipulation and calculated cruelty were undeniable. The foundation aimed to help others recognize the warning signs to prevent another tragedy before it could unfold. As for Tara Lintz, she vanished from the public eye after the trial. Her involvement in the case had made her infamous, and the weight of her connection to the murders followed her everywhere. While she had never directly harmed Sherry or the children, her role in pressuring Chris to act could never be erased. Justice had been served, but there was no victory to celebrate. 3 innocent lives had been stolen, and no prison sentence could bring them back. The community of Columbia, Illinois, would never be the same, forever haunted by the brutal crime that had unfolded in their midst. What do you think about this case? Could anything have been done to stop Chris Coleman before it was too late? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Crime Docket for more chilling true crime stories like this. See you in the next video.